Coming up, we continue our training camp coverage today, talking about Brian Burns and how he and Kayvon Thibodeau are forming a bond early in camp, how he is going to help Andrew Thomas become a better offensive tackle, if that's even possible, and how he, Brian Burns, still believes in Azeez Ojulari. We come in next. Yes, my friends. It is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your host. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. Over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise. Maybe one of us is a little more energized than the other on a Monday morning, Andy, but we're talking about training camp, and we're focusing in really on the reaching impact of technically free agent, technically trade, but the acquisition of one Brian Burns this offseason and how critical he's going to be to both sides of the football for Big Blue.
Yeah, Adam, we obviously highlighted on the Friday show the impact that Malik Neighbors is having. We could probably have a whole show on just the things that he's doing and the separation that he's getting. But
Yes,
the
sir.
two biggest moves that the Giants made in the offseason were getting an offensive weapon in Malik Neighbors and making a huge swing on the defensive side of the ball by acquiring Brian Burns, giving up draft capital, and paying him almost $30 million. And so, Adam, we talked about this before. What type of impact does Brian Burns need to have? He can't be just a double-digit sack guy. He has to be much, much more than that. And it is, what are the sack totals? What are the pressure totals? But it is all of these other tangential things. When you have an all-pro type player, the other players see it. They know it. They see confidence that he's going to get home. And to your point, it makes our offensive line have to play better. We can't have a false sense of security in the offseason in training camp being like, oh, this offensive line looks great. And it's more because it's been pass rushers that can't get to the quarterback. And then all of a sudden we open up week one like last year against Dallas, and it becomes an absolute train wreck.
Of course. No, I mean, listen, this is the idea of, we talk about Joe Shane, the off seasons, the draft classes, turning over the roster, getting his guys and his personnel. You listen to Shane Bowen when they do it during the Hard Knocks saying like, hey, this is the only guy you're going to get. Is that enough? Yeah, I think I'll make it work. Like, this is why you need to add pieces like this to improve your roster overall. There is the camp battle, which I found some people, this is always interesting to me, just this kind of a quick side note on Andrew Thomas, because they're going against each other in camp. And obviously, like Brian Burns, you hope that he does beat Andrew Thomas sometimes, because otherwise you'd say, well, oh, Andrew Thomas is a stud, but Brian Burns, hey, he's going to go up against the best in the league every single week. He needs to be able to get past them. And I sometimes find fans interesting or fickle around it, where they're like, oh boy, Brian Burns, like he beat Andrew Thomas like multiple reps at camp. You're like, yeah, of course. Same way that Tay Banks is getting beat multiple reps by Malik Neighbors in camp. That's a whole other iron sharpening iron here in camp that we have, which is really good for, I think, the New York Football Giants, just as that little tiny pocket of established players, obviously Thomas more so than even Banks going into year two, but having these established players that we believe talent level is there. These are going to be stalwarts for the team at their positions. And then you have the new guys coming in, whether it's Brian Burns, experienced veteran, or rookie Malik Neighbors, and saying like, okay, hey, let's see. Let's see if you have that, because remember, years past, we were in training camp saying player X, Y, or Z looks phenomenal, but we kept having to caveat it and say, I mean, relative to who they're going against, like we don't know what that looks like against real talent on the NFL level. So that's another positive here for how this offseason at least is progressing so far.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple different things when we talk about leadership. Obviously, play on the field dictates leadership in that regard. But there's also just like alpha males that have more talent than other people that can just impose their will on the opposition. And you look at guys like Brian Burns is showing that early on in camp, like Malik Neighbors is doing it. Adam, when you think back just a year ago, right? When you think about training camp, who were the alphas that were in the room? Who are the people that you said definitively were making an impact? Remember that the team had just moved on, over the last two seasons, say, from guys like Jabril Peppers, Logan Ryan, James Bradbury. There was a lot of
Jordan Love,
even
who was a bit of a vocal leader for the team. Jordan Love on the back end of the defense.
Well, if we had Jordan Love right now, I think our quarterback situation would be a little bit better. But to your point, Julian Love, who just got another contract with the Seattle Seahawks, he's another one that the Giants have lost.
The same player, Andy.
Yeah.
They're basically the same player.
But to your point, we're talking about veteran.
That's actually tragically, just real quick, that's actually why it was so difficult, because the Giants didn't realize Jordan Love was actually a quarterback. So playing him at safety was a real mistake.
Oh yeah, playing him out of
It's a
position.
classic. It's a classic swing and a miss. Please
Packers
continue.
switched it up. Now he's the highest paid quarterback in the league,
Yep,
right?
that's the way it goes. Sorry,
No,
please continue.
but I just think too, not having those types of players in the locker room, like Dexter Lawrence is a leader, but he's kind of on the defensive interior, doesn't necessarily know if he's the guy that's rallying the troops or speaking up too much. Andrew Thomas, obviously left tackle, just coming into his own, but it really does feel like this offseason we have some dudes, right? Like I don't know how to explain it more than like we have a couple guys that if you put them on any field, you instantly point to that guy. You're like, that's the best player at his position, right?
Well, and I agree with you. And remember, too, it's also a year ago where you knew coming into that season, whether it was the attempts to sign Saquon Barkley to a longer-term contract during the season that didn't work out, or knowing that Xavier McKinney was a pending free agent, they're going to make choices about that too. So even some of the guys, as you mentioned, hey, it's the play on the field that dictates first and foremost what your hierarchy is in terms of other players on the roster looking and going, yeah, we follow that guy's lead. Why? Because he's one of our best players. But then it's also the trickle-down effect there of having most of your best players kind of be in a state of limbo. Even we're not putting Daniel Jones as one of the Giants' best players, but one of the highest paid players. But then he's injured and he's not on the field. So you really can look back at last season if you want to compare. It's funny, before we get into a couple of these quotes from Brian Burns, it's funny to look back at the last 2 years and think about that, right? The height of going to the playoffs, of winning a playoff game, and then the lull of coming out and injuries and a little bit of discomfort around who's going to be coming or going over the course of a year. Then the losses start to pile up. Like there is that contrast. And while it's not just because they didn't have vocal leaders in the locker room, or why it's not just because Saquon Barkley didn't have a long-term deal in place, all these things matter. The percentages are a lot lower than just being really good and winning football games together on the field. But I do think that the locker room stuff, the leadership stuff, and having some sense of stability matters. And then you can even throw, obviously, on the defensive side, a guy like Wink Martindale, not exactly offering what we would call, quote unquote, stability inside of that room. We'll come back here in a second, get Andy's thoughts on that, and then turn our page over to these Brian Burns comments as we continue today's OGP. All right, Andy, before we dive into the Brian Burns quotes, we first and foremost let you know this episode is brought to you by Personam. It's an AI-driven cyber threat detection engine. Personam improves your vision into your network security environment and allows you to see cyber threats that other platforms and tools simply cannot do. Personam is always vigilant and always learning. Thoughts, last notes on the leadership in these last couple of seasons before we turn to Brian Burns quotes?
No, you just mentioned Wink Martindale was kind of the larger than life figure as the defensive coordinator. It was like his show, whereas Shane Bowen seems like a guy that kind of sits a little bit more in the background and lets the players on the field kind of dictate that. It's just a whole different philosophy, a whole different type of players on the field. We've talked before about how we may speak a little bit about alternate universes. If you didn't go out and acquire Brian Burns with draft capital, what would you have done?
Sure.
I mean, so far through camp, you've seen everything that you want to see from guys like Brian Burns and Malik Neighbors.
Now, Andy, I'm going to read you a quote, and then I'm going to ask you a question like you're sitting before a congressional inquiry into some of your past transgressions against the New York Football Giants. Here it is right here for you, sir. I think he's very gifted. Just his build alone, he has extremely long arms and natural leverage, so that makes him a premium pass rusher. As far as his build, he's been doing great so far. I expect big things from him this year. I assert to you, sir. That is Brian Burns speaking on Azeez Ojulari. Do you still stand firm that he will be cut this season?
Well.
By the way, feel free to take as much time as you need to acknowledge what an incredible JFK impression that was.
I mean, that threw me off just a little bit because I'm trying to give my stance on Azeez Ojulari. So, Adam, let's start with the basics.
Okay.
If Azeez Ojulari gets traded for a late round pick, would you consider that also being cut? As in, like, Azeez Ojulari may not be on the roster this season.
No. Let's focus on and I'm not throwing any under the bus around this, but surprise cut candidates when we talked about it. You put Azeez Ojulari up. I'm talking training camp. He doesn't make it out of training camp. He is not on this roster going into the season. And so you're saying, would I include a training camp or off-season trade prior to the year
Correct.
starting? Okay. Preseason, before week 1, yes, we can put those into the same category as being cut or traded for a late round pick. We'll put them together. Yes.
We're right, because it's like if you're like, okay, our intent is to move on from him, but we can get now a 7th round pick instead of cutting him. Like that's what we're gonna do. So that's kind of what I had in my mind. But yes, I think once week 1 comes in, like he's on the roster. Yes, you're saying like if the Giants were to struggle out of the gate and all of a sudden the trade deadline, he's a valuable piece. That's not even what I'm considering.
Right.
What I'm considering on Azeez Ojulari is a few different factors. One, his health. Azeez Ojulari has not had the ability to stay healthy the last 2 seasons. He started 5 games in 2022 and 7 games in 2023. At the total of 12 games started, he played in 18 of those total. And Adam, it's not only just the games not being played, it's the production on the field was not good enough to the point where they had to go out and trade for the man that we just spoke about before in Brian Burns. It's easy for Brian Burns to say how awesome he looks when he just took the guy's job and he's going to be starting in front of him, right? The other thing I will say is on the field, production wise, it hasn't been that great either. I feel like everyone had all of this promise for him because in year 1, he played in 17 games, he started in 13 and had 8 sacks. Ever since then, Adam, he has declined in terms of the amount of sacks, the missed tackle percentage, the passer rating and passer coverage. Every single statistic that you see, Azeez Ojulari continues to decline to the point where last season in those games played when he was healthy, played in 11 games, had 2.5 sacks. And now you could say, well, the team was playing from behind a lot, didn't have as many opportunities. Kayvon Thibodeau found a way to get the double-digit sacks. And so for me, I look at it and I say, lastly, the cap implications. Azeez Ojulari doesn't cost that much money, so I can understand why he would be on this roster, Adam. But if you look at the breakdown of his $2.1 million cap hit, his salary for this season, $500K of that is essentially would be dead cap. The Giants could save almost $1.6 million if they were to move on from Azeez Ojulari this offseason. And so for me, can't stay healthy. Production has been declining. You traded for a guy that you believe in more than him. And you can free up $1.5 million in cap space to maybe go out and pick up a cornerback or another position, maybe even a backup offensive lineman, depending on what happens with Evan Neal. So that is my case for Azeez Ojulari not being here. Tell me where I'm wrong.
Well, yeah, I'll play the devil's advocate of it, right? And again, that's why we compartmentalize it, because I think there's a world where Azeez Ojulari can look pretty good over the start of the season because he's playing behind Brian Burns and behind Thibodeau. And then as you get to the deadline, the Giants and Joe Schoen are still doing the same math. Well, are we re-signing him? Or are we bringing him back? If he starts to look pretty good here, it's probably going to price out anyway, and we're not going to over-allocate money to that position when we know that Thibodeau is going to be coming down the pike for his next contract. So there's probably just some things from that standpoint. But there's the other side of it where are we winning football games or not? If we're winning football games, then guess what? We're playing out the string and he's contributing. That's a good thing. If it's about, hey, this is still kind of clunky, we're still working on getting all our pieces in place, that makes it easier too. If I wanted to paint a picture, the one thing I'm going to acknowledge that you mentioned there that like is really disturbing is he went from 9.3% in missed tackle percentage to 15.8 in this last season, playing in 11 games, starting 7 of those. Like that is a big problem when you talk about playing there on the edge, trying to set the edge, those running plays, that escapability of mobile quarterbacks. If you're not able to, being there is one thing. Getting the QB, getting the running back down to the ground, that's phase number 2. And even more important than showing up there. Because guess what? If you're there and you don't make the tackle, it doesn't matter nearly as much. So that's concerning to me. If I wanted to paint a positive picture, there's something interesting about the idea that in his rookie season, where obviously he played all 17 games, started 13, he was only brought on a blitz 23 times. He was brought 64 times underneath Wink Martindale last year in just 11 games, starting just 7 of them. Like, there's something about the Wink Martindale system, and you mentioned Thibodeau and him getting his numbers. Like, listen, Thibodeau is already shown, as he should, because he was taken in the top 5 of the draft class, that he's a better player than Azeez Ojulari. But there is something to, like, what is the skill set of the player? How is he best utilized? And whether or not Wink Martindale had the ability to look at players individually and make that assessment. So on a pure play standpoint, like I'll let you respond to that part of it. Like, hey, just pure fit, not health yet, but just on a pure fit, I think Wink Martindale probably only did a service to a smaller percentage of the defensive side of the ball than to the total team.
Yeah, well, the thing that you mentioned about Kayvon Thibodeau, so I found it interesting when they talked about his production in the middle of the season. He made a comment like, "You got to kind of look at what I'm being asked to do." Right? He wasn't being sent on every single play. It wasn't pin your ears back and go get the quarterback because Wink Martindale has so many exotic blitzes. Sometimes
Yeah.
you'll have to drop back in coverage. The same can be true for Azeez Ojulari. However, Adam, I feel like it's a push and a pull when you talk about
Mhm.
Azeez Ojulari. If your sacks are high, it means you're getting after the quarterback and you're probably not making as many tackles in the open field. You're not asking to be dropped back. He had
Yeah.
his lowest sack total and his highest missed tackle rate. So he's
Yep.
not getting after the quarterback. And when he's asked to be playing back and drop back in coverage, he's not actually doing that job very well either. So for me, it's like if he had 12 sacks and his tackle, missed tackle percentage was very, very high, you're like, well, at least he's getting to the quarterback. He's wrecking the game. He's not doing either of those pieces of it.
Sure. So I'm going to keep trying to push back. I'm here for the fan base that believes in Azeez, at least in the short term. The other thing you could look at would be that in just 423 defensive reps this past season with the injuries, he still hurried the QB 8 times, only 3 the year prior and 14 in his rookie year. So you can look there and say, well, it's only 11 games. He played 780 snaps in his rookie season. So in, 55% of his rookie season in terms of snap work, he still got to 8 hurries. He also had 5 QB knockdowns. So this is the classic like Leonard Williams version of this we used to talk about sometimes where, hey, okay, he's not quite getting home, but he is getting close. 5 knockdowns for the QB, that's the most that he had in his career, and that's doing it playing only, again, 423 reps, played only 230 the year prior, where even in that season, again, where he only played those 230 reps, had 4 QB knockdowns. So 16 pressures this past season, 13 the year prior. Like, there are these things. This is really what it comes down to. Like, these are all my cases for why, like, Azeez Ojulari is a good player. Guess what? The reason why the Giants were able to draft him was because he had injury concerns coming out. That's why he fell into the second round. And guess what? The injury concerns are still real. So there's a big part of this that really is just about, can he stay healthy enough to then be productive, even in a reduced role? I think that's as much a part of it as anything. Do I think that you should be asking him to be dropping into coverage in the Shane Bowen system? No, he's not that guy. He is not the athletic player that Kayvon Thibodeau is, right? So there's a difference in terms of what you should be asking this player to do. I can see a world, I can paint a picture where Azeez Ojulari ends up having, if let's assume that he plays the whole year for the Giants, where he ends up having 5, maybe 6 sacks, because the role and the way that Shane Bowen uses him is going to be, when I bring you in, it's to do this specific thing. I don't mean just going after and blitzing the quarterback, but it's going to be telling you, and we've heard this all the time over the years, hey, what are your best qualities? I want to elevate those and I want to minimize the things that you're not good at. And I think if you really pigeonhole him into what he's best suited for, you can get the most value. Does that mean that I think he's being brought back on another contract? Do I think that means that he won't be? No, none of that means that. But I do think that the injuries, unfortunately, and a Wink Martindale defensive scheme have clouded a little bit of what he is just as a natural player versus what the total package is, which is a muddled one at best. And oh, by the way, he's a previous regime's draft pick, and that's a huge factor in all of it as well.
And keep in mind, we mentioned the new coordinator, Shane Bowen. He likes
Yeah.
these guys that can go beat someone one-on-one. We're not going to do crazy exotic blitz packages. You need to beat your man. And
Yeah.
relatively speaking, the more athletic you are, if you can couple that with the intelligence of how to get around someone, you have more success. And Adam, Brian Burns, we talk about the relative athletic score. Kentley Platt does a great job putting together all the measurables of like how athletic, how freak of nature is this guy.
Yeah.
Brian Burns scored a 9.9 out of 10. He was the 13th out of 1,200 defensive ends dating back all the way to 1987. Brian Burns is a freak athlete. Kayvon Thibodeau, he scored a 9.67. He was 47th out of almost 1,400 people that were tested. And then you have
Right.
Azeez Ojulari, who had an 8.1. So he's significantly lower down the list. You're talking about Brian Burns and Kayvon Thibodeau being able to beat people one-on-one with their pure athleticism. Azeez Ojulari isn't that type of player, and also is oft-injured. And so that to me is the reason why, if you're the Giants and you saw and you're a fan that saw Hard Knocks, you saw Shane Bowen saying, can Boogie Basham be that guy? Can
Sure.
Ryder Anderson be that guy? They're already talking about people other than Azeez Ojulari potentially stepping up and making that role. And if you can reallocate 1.5 million to somewhere else, maybe that's something that the Giants need to explore.
Yeah, I think those are all really fair points when it comes with it. So, last note on him, very early, obviously. Do you stand by the idea that he is well, first of all, do you stand by that he is your surprise cut candidate coming out of training camp? And do you believe that he'll be here through the entirety of the season?
I don't see a world where Azeez Ojulari is with the team long term.
Okay.
Now he's obviously doing well in camp already. He's been wreaking havoc in the quarterback playing against some of the twos. It's a tough one for me, Adam. I just look at the production and the injury concerns, and I say you've just spent so much capital on Brian Burns, and a lot of it has to do with how much capital you spent there. That if you could get something of value for Azeez Ojulari, why wouldn't you kind of shift the capital in terms of money and draft assets or whatever to another area of need, knowing that he's only going to get limited reps and maybe Boogie Basham and others can give you 85% of what Azeez Ojulari can do. So for me, my answer is yes. I think he's the biggest surprise that will potentially not be on this roster moving forward.
Let's talk about coming up here in a second. Another guy that's still on this roster that maybe surprises some people. We actually got, I think, some really fun pushback around not looking or overlooking Darius Slayton as we work our way through training camp. Something that we have not done over the course of this show. We have been maybe arguably two in Darius Slayton's corner. Let's hear a little bit about how the offseason unfolded, Darius Slayton's active choices, and have a little bit of fun about Giants history at the wide receiver position, all coming up next. All right, so as we continue today's OGP episode, we remind you, get over to YouTube, check out some of the videos we have live going up, usually once a week, to try to talk about some of the latest news. So you get your alerts turned on over there. We'll also be providing you in the show notes. You can go ahead and sign up for the membership. A couple extra perks come through that way. It's a way to show us a little bit of love and let us keep building this little empire that we call OGP. So be sure to do that if you please. Darius Slayton is still a New York Football Giant, Andy. I don't know if you knew that. He's in camp. We've talked about Jalen Hyatt and how he's coming on and what we're looking to have this wide receiver room look like coming out of camp. But I did find it interesting, one, that Joe Schoen came out and said we had options to trade Darius Slayton, but trading Darius Slayton was never an option. Instead, they put the incentives in the contract, as we know, and ended that little short holdout that he had and got him back in the room. He's obviously the veteran inside this wide receiver group. He's the most familiar with Daniel Jones. And when you hear Darius Slayton say, people wanted to trade for me, people don't trade for bad players or people that don't trade for people who haven't played good ball in this league. So it's not like I couldn't have been elsewhere. I chose to be here. At the end of the day, that means something. I know who I am. I know what I've done. I know the caliber of player that I am. And hopefully I get a chance to show that this year. Just a little point stop. How do we feel about Darius Slayton coming into this training camp? We've talked about his kind of consistent 700 plus yards per year numbers that he puts up. Do we feel like this is a little cleaning up the mess by Joe Schoen, a little over bravado from Darius Slayton, or can it all be legitimate that the organization and the player didn't really want to have to get too far? Giants wanted to keep veteran experience, and Darius Slayton just wanted to get a little more money because he looked around and saw how some guys were cashing checks this offseason.
Every word that Darius Slayton said is 100% true.
Yes.
Every single word that he said. He's
Yes.
like, I'm productive. There's interest in me on the market. He left out the in the parentheses at the current contract that I am under, which is a very, very team friendly contract, right? Like Darius Slayton making under $8 million a year as a very productive wide receiver is great value. Joe Schoen is not lying. I don't think Joe Schoen was lying when he said there's interest, but why would we trade such a great value in terms of what Darius Slayton brings? He's stays relatively healthy. He's productive on the field. He's liked in the locker room, and he stretches the field vertically. 15 yards per attempt is basically what happens when he gets out there on the field making catches. And so I don't think anyone's telling a lie. I think Darius Slayton was just like, I want a little bit more money. I don't have any security after this year. Joe Schoen turned around and said, we don't have money. Clearly, you saw Saquon Barkley. We don't have the money to be able to pay you, nor do we necessarily want to, but we want you to be here. And if there's a way for us to sweeten the pot so that you'll come in and we can all be happy, let's do that. I think the challenge is Joe Schoen not giving him a deal makes it if Darius Slayton even plays, decently or what he's done in his career, that this
Sure.
will probably be the last season of Darius Slayton because he may say, this is the role that they've had me in the last couple of years. Maybe I could be a wide receiver number 2 and get paid accordingly on another team.
Yeah, and it's funny too because he's 27 years old, so he'll be 28 after this season. Like, where are you going to be in the NFL landscape another year from now? And that's probably, I think, why, as you mentioned, is he being honest? Is he being truthful? Of course he is, like 100%. But also, he was pushing to try to let's maximize the value right now for a couple of reasons. One, because you see the money getting thrown around the market. Two, because I see where I might be a year from now and getting out to free agency, or 2 years from now and just saying like, hey, who's coming after me at 28, at 29 years old? It's going to be a lot harder to find a spot for myself, or at least a significant contract. And then three, I look inside the room and I see that every year you have drafted in the first, the second, and the third round wide receivers. So I clearly understand that the writing on the wall in terms of me being maybe even, the number 2 wide receiver in this group is certainly sliding down the totem pole. Like, you're preparing for life after me. And that's okay. Like, that's the nature of the NFL. So I think he pushed as hard as he could to get there. At the end of the day, not that we're ending, but at the end of the day, Andy, the thing that I think is fascinating about a player like him is when you go and look at the stats in terms of all time receiving leaders. Darius Slayton, man, do you know where he is in terms of receptions, in terms of yardage, in terms of touchdowns? Give me your 4 or 5 range, position range inside of the receiving room, which includes tight ends, by the way, and includes running backs like Tiki Barber's in the mix because he had a lot of catches as well. Jeremy Shockey, all those kind of guys. Where do you think he is all time?
I'm going to guess that Darius Slayton somewhere in the 12 to 16 range.
Okay, well, Andy, it would have been more impressive if you had aimed a little bit lower. He is 21 or 22 in all of those categories, just over 3,300 yards, has 19 touchdowns. So when you go and look at his numbers, and the reason why I bring it up is because the all-time leader, as everyone knows, is Amani Toomer. And Amani Toomer, like, I don't think by NFL standards, he was ever mentioned as one of the best in the league, right? But he was one of the most consistent for the New York Football Giants year over year when it came to having guys that you could rely on. If Darius Slayton can even pseudo repeat a little bit of what he's done over going into his 6th year now, if he can do that 60%, right, and get himself to 30 touchdowns on his career, get himself another 1,700 yards, 1,000 yards, and be up near 5,000, that he's only like kind of three seasons away of 700 plus yards and 3 or 4 touchdowns and 70 receptions. He'll overtake Odell Beckham Jr. as the second all-time in yardage in franchise history. And while I don't know if the fan base cares now that Malik Nabers is there and we're thinking about the future and we get rid of Daniel Jones and the rebuild and the new QB and all that stuff, I think there's something to be said for the fact that this guy quietly, not unlike Saquon Barkley, who was like putting up, more elite talent, better, higher profile, all that stuff, but putting up like good numbers on bad teams for a number of years. Darius Slayton was never supposed to be a number 1 wide receiver, but he's put up consistent number 2 numbers his entire career. And we may look back another 2 years from now, and if Wan'Dale Robinson doesn't work out, or if Jalen Hyatt doesn't work out, even if Malik Nabers is your elite true number 1 talent, you're still going to be looking around and maybe remembering a guy that put in a heck of a lot of effort to go from being a 5th round pick to being a pretty consistent player who showed up every week and was healthy every week. He had his drops. He's not a perfect player. Like, don't get me wrong. But it's just interesting to see where he could be. And I don't know if that's maybe more telling about Darius Slayton's career or about the Giants wide receiver core historically. I'm not sure what narrative I've painted about the Giants overall as an organization.
Well, you are right, and it is surprising how productive he is. If he decides to end up wanting to play the rest of his career with the Giants, you could see him move up those lists into the top 15, areas that I mentioned before. The comparison to Odell Beckham, obviously, Odell did it in such a short amount of time, and it was like,
that's not.
He was like a star that, like a comet that just like burst in the middle of the air. But
of course,
your point to Darius Slayton's value, and at the end of the day, the thing with him is his production is so good where he may actually have significantly more value to a team. Even like, look at the New England Patriots. They've got Kendrick Bourne, Demario Douglas, KJ Osborne, Juju Smith-Schuster, and then just drafted both Jalen Polk and Javon Baker in the mid to late rounds of this season, Darius Slayton could walk into that wide receiver room and basically say, I'm one of the best wide receivers here.
Yeah.
And we know that Juju Smith-Schuster has had 1,000 yards before. I personally think that Darius Slayton's a better wide receiver today than Juju Smith-Schuster is in terms of all the separation that he gets and things like that. But he does have value across the league. There's no question about that. We talked about Azeez Ojulari may not be here. If the Giants long term don't think that they're going to get a deal done with Darius Slayton, they've obviously already socialized what those figures should look like. I'm guessing it's in the $9 to $10 million range. You could see him being a prime trade candidate if the season doesn't get off to the right start, Adam. And it's tough because I think we all like him. You mentioned before, we've given him his flowers and we think that he deserves much more notoriety from the fan base for being the only consistent outside threat over the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
But man, he could command, and a team that has a couple of injuries. Darius Slayton steps in. He could be a piece to a team where maybe someone gives up a 4th round pick for Darius Slayton, and all of a sudden you can kind of reset the market and get yourself some more draft capital. It's a really fascinating position where he is really valuable, but he may even be more valuable for another team that desperately needs what Darius Slayton's bringing to the table.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about what teams would want him. So, at the end of the day, talking about Azeez Ojulari and talking about Darius Slayton, as the season unfolds, what teams maybe look at these two players and where do they value them, right? They value a guy in Darius Slayton that has some consistency and maybe pops because they have a number one and they want to see that explode. And by the way, that can be the benefit of having Malik Neighbors for the Giants, showing the league, hey, if you have a number one wide receiver and you need another guy in that group, look, now all of a sudden Darius Slayton was on pace to have his first 1,000-yard season because there was a number one ahead of him, or he's catching a few more touchdowns because the number one is ahead of him. So there could be some value there. And then you flip it over defensively. Who thinks, do we have the defensive front that makes us better? Do we look at Azeez Ojulari and we're a bad team who, hey, for a late round pick, we'll go ahead and get a body in this room that'll be here. We'll re-sign him in the offseason. The contract won't be crazy and we'll continue to improve our team. So it's always fun to me to think about players relative to where's your organization currently? Where's the regime currently in terms of GMs and who brought these players in? And then where are contracts going to be? Because everyone is shuffling those pieces. And I think you can't have these conversations about any one player without talking about the other 73 factors that teams go through. So fascinating to see how it unfolds. At a minimum right now, I've been liking what you've seen from Darius Slayton. It's fun to watch that wide receiver group in camp. And then on the flip side, listen, great, flashy, all those amazing things being said about Azeez. Ultimately, he's got to be healthy. I mean, that's it. And that's the big difference between these two conversations. One guy has always been healthy, maybe just doesn't have a really talented wide receiver room to be a part of. The other player is sometimes you look good, but more often than not, you can't be on the field. And that's something that's really hard to risk if you're the Giants and if you're Shane Bowen on that side of the ball. Guys, we had a journey today, and I enjoyed it. I hope you did too. One of the things we can do is you can get over to the podcast feeds and subscribe to those. If they give you the opportunity, leave a glowing 5-star review. And as I mentioned earlier in the episode as well, check this out right here. If you're on YouTube and you're watching, you can pause it, and scan that code. It'll take you over to the membership area on YouTube. You can make choices between a few different tiers. There's some different perks at each level. And we're really excited to start doing some additional content for everybody and trying to build this as we continue to work our way through the summer. And frankly, man, it's almost the end of July. We're getting into now preseason football. That's going to be a lot of fun too. So take a look at that. Also, the member link is in the show notes of this episode too. We always appreciate everybody coming through on OGP. So until the next time. Until the best times, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.